whenever you're ready. Okay. Okay, Satini, Stakat Johan, Ganaschish for being here. I know that there's a field trip right now, so I know a lot of people are off looking at petroglyphs. Kind of wish I was off looking at petroglyphs. Just cancel the presentation, we'll go out to the beach. But it's good to see everybody. My name is Ida, I'll do my introduction here in a second. Talking about jiné, jiyís, giving work and academic partnerships. First, though, I want to say Lingít Kachana Ka Shika Hin Kwan for hosting us, for welcoming us here to Wrangell. Really appreciate the hospitality that's been shown. It's always good to be able to gather here in Tlingit Ani, and especially here in Kitchkanaak. This is the second time I'm here, really appreciating all of the welcome and support, knowing that for the community in Shukadhin Kwan, that this is a difficult time, so really appreciate them still being gracious hosts as they're working through grief. Ida, ka heather dan Burge, yu chatu asak, atut chat jim du detan, achawe ganach tedi aya, nath na chatsati, gonerti achat, awati, achawe achtla, yu du asak, gonerti marsha hach, achtla tsa Judy Holder, yu du asak, tleka yadiaya, jithkat kwan ka agwasasne kwan dach, ganingeha dachchan aya, zantikahini ye khatyati. So my Tlingit name is Ida, my English name is Heather Burge. I was adopted by Gonerti Marsha Hotch from Klukwan, Alaska, so I'm Ganach Katie from Jithkat Kwan. I'm also a grandchild of the Mohawk people from the Akwesasne Reserve. My grandfather's side, I wasn't raised there, wasn't raised knowing that, so I'm reconnecting to that indigenous part of my ancestry as well. And I currently live in Zantikahini, or Juneau, Alaska. I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, focused on Tlingit language revitalization in the Department of Linguistics, so linguistic anthropology. I got my master's in linguistics also from UBC. And then before that, I am an alumni of UAS, graduated in 2015 with my bachelor's in liberal arts, focused on Alaska Native languages and studies, and have been learning Tlingit since about 2011. My PhD, like I said, focuses on Tlingit language revitalization, specifically on the roles that universities play, academics play within that work. What's been successful? What do we need to rethink about some of those partnerships? Looking at things like language ideology, so what people think about language, why people learn, why people have challenges learning Tlingit. How can we remove some of those barriers to learning to really build something sustainable and equitable and strong for our Tlingit language learning communities, or Indigenous language revitalization in general. So the main question today that I wanted folks to sort of consider is what role can and or should academia play in Indigenous language revitalization? So obviously this is a part of one of the questions that I'm reflecting on as part of my PhD research, but I think as we continue to grow language programming, as we continue to grow partnerships with universities, such as UAS and other universities here in Alaska, as well as in Canada, it's important to reflect on historically some of the problematic behaviors of the academy, of researchers coming in and being extractive, taking things and not giving back to the community, in ways we can make sure that that doesn't continue to happen as we grow Indigenous students within our programs and grow Indigenous faculty, staff in support of this work. So as we're talking, sort of that's the main question as the thread throughout the presentation. Hade, our path. So first, we're still going to talk about Tlingit Yukatangiadat, Tlingit language in general. For an audience like this, I feel like most people are familiar, at least a little bit, with Tlingit, at least theoretically. Talk a little bit about my PhD background, so sort of why I'm doing this work, some of the ways I've been thinking about it thus far, and some of the things that I'm hoping that this work will contribute to the overall goal of Tlingit language revitalization, Indigenous language revitalization across our communities. So the second section will be sort of perspectives based on my specific roles within that movement as a student, as a researcher, and now as a professor at the University of Alaska. Some successes and challenges of some of that work, so collaborations, programs that we have within the academy, things that seem to be bringing in students, ways in which those have been successful, ways in which there's still barriers to access there. Needed changes, so reflecting on historically the baggage that comes with working in a university setting and things that we should have a conversation about how to address some of those very real historical and contemporary issues around university work. And then we'll sort of wrap it up with a return to the question, some takeaway thoughts, open it up for questions. Sound good? Okay. So Tlingit Yuk'atangidat. Tlingit is a language spoken here in Southeast Alaska, as well as in the Yukon and northern British Columbia. In Alaska, it is one of 23 or so languages. Folks perhaps are familiar with this Alaska Native Language map. Tlingit Ani is located here in this burnt gold color. And so as we think about language revitalization for Tlingit specifically, we also have to think about it in relation to language revitalization as a whole for the state. Sometimes that means Alaska Native languages in the state vary in number of speakers, vary in resources and programs that are available, in the current, I guess, status of the languages, how many people are learning, how many speakers these individual communities have. And so as we're talking about Tlingit specifically, because that's what I'm most familiar with, I'm hoping that this conversation can also apply, give something to reflect on for folks in other language communities. I know here in Southeast Alaska we have Haida and Tsimshian, learners, speakers, scholars as well, so recognizing the relationships languages have with each other. Similarly, in the Yukon, Tlingit is part of a larger Yukon First Nations language revitalization movement with various partnerships, intermarriages, people learning multiple languages, and so recognizing the connection between those communities as well. I know that there are some Yukoners here in the room, so I'll thank Naftish, Daka Kwan for coming here to the coast. Tlingit is a branch of the Na-Dene Athabascan language family. What does that mean? Tlingit is related to Dene languages, Athabascan languages. I won't spend a ton of time talking about that there, but there are, Zeus James Crippen has a family tree of the relationships between different languages and how they're connected to one another. So if you're interested in that, there's a number of resources that he's published that you can take a look at. For Tlingit, right now there's an estimated 40 or so first-generation birth speakers. Ane Lance Twitchell has posted, and it might be unpublished at the moment, some keeping track of some of those numbers. When we talk about numbers of speakers, that can get into, it's a big conversation about how we decide who's a speaker or not, like how that's determined, but all this to say that Tlingit, like many Alaska Native languages, Indigenous languages across the world, is in a place of really big change. We have few speakers, and we're currently really pushing to teach people as quickly and as effectively as possible why we have birth speakers for people to sit with. A little bit about my PhD research. So looking at language revitalization, Indigenous language revitalization as a whole, I originally proposed this sort of 4-house post metaphor to support that work. So watching and writing about the path, what we've done in the past, when language revitalization for Tlingit seemed to start, programs that were effective, programs that perhaps were effective but due to funding were paused or stopped, sort of the trajectory of language work specific for Tlingit, and then sort of looking at that path we've built so far, very much on the shoulders of giants that have started this work long before I was born, and looking at ways in which we can continue to build on that foundation, sort of explaining the purpose and process of how that work has happened, and then ideally proposing a path forward for Tlingit language revitalization, particularly in university settings, and then hopefully having something that if there are other communities interested in doing something similar, there would be opportunity for collaboration and exchange of that knowledge. Some things that I'm hoping that this PhD research will contribute to Lingít language revitalization work is this relationship building practices and processes. So I'll talk a little bit about the challenges of being an Indigenous scholar within the university setting and how often these relationship building practices are undervalued or devalued within some of our current institutional systems in ways in which I think we need to address some of that disparity between value if we're going to build something sustainable and long-term. Looking at collaborative research models that support community needs, so jiyís, hands together, this collaborative research model that makes sure that we're not repeating the sort of the traumas of the past in response to a more extractive research method where people come, sometimes called helicopter anthropology, helicopter linguistics. People land, they take things, they leave, they share or perhaps only share portions of what they've learned, and then they go back to their own communities with that knowledge, without that reciprocity and that model of exchange. Making sure that all of the material that is being produced is usable, is accessible, is useful for the community, and then finally being a part of that movement, participating in the movement, jiné, working within the community, within the group, as an integral partner to the work. So that's a little background, PhD, a little background on Lingít. Perspectives, so chade, khatnayu, we're not supposed to really talk about ourselves, and so I know by talking a little bit about my perspective, it kind of gets into, I'm so cool, but I think it's important to consider the way Indigenous students, Indigenous researchers, and Indigenous faculty member the experiences that those three experiences have, reflecting on recruiting people into this movement, reflecting on barriers that I've experienced in all three of those identities, I guess, in hopes that it ensures that those barriers, that those challenges aren't just perpetuated for the students that I'm teaching, for the colleagues that will be joining this work, and for the colleagues that I currently have. So ensuring that the students just have a better experience than perhaps I did. So we're always constantly trying to grow and change and be better about the things that we're doing. Ensuring that the research and academic work is collaborative and in line with community values. Ensuring future colleagues have a safe and supportive environment to grow. And ensuring current colleagues are included in that conversation and to sort of reflect on where we currently are. So that's the reason why I'm sort of talking about these three, I guess, spheres of experience in hopes that it'll be useful in the future. So perspectives, my undergraduate perspective, some things that I found particularly positive about that experience. So like I said, I was a student at the University of Alaska Southeast. Graduated there. As a student, I felt like the community at large was quite supportive. I was adopted into the community by one of my instructors. Some of my very best friends are in Lingít language work, and it was because of that experience at UAS that I was able to build those connections with people. I felt like, at least for UAS, there was already a foundation for Indigenous leadership and excellence that was built. So there's Hooch, an Indigenous leadership club that was started in the 1990s. There were alumni of that program that still participated and still supported, and still to this day still support that work. Many of my instructors were Indigenous faculty, so I had Indigenous Lingít teachers, Kone and Koneoti, Marsha Hooch being two of them, had Indigenous philosophy instructors, Saul Neely was one of them, and so there was a really good representation at the time that I was an undergraduate of Indigenous faculty in those programs, and there was a really strong peer group, so there were a lot of students really interested in learning and building something sustainable, and building that support was really crucial to my success as an undergraduate. Some challenges, however, of that experience, that there was no programming at the time, really. There were language classes, but there wasn't a bachelor's really focused on language work. The Bachelor of Liberal Arts that I graduated with in 2015. I think I was the second cohort to graduate, so that wasn't created until probably my 4th year at the university. And so kind of pushing the university system to build these programs was something, as a student, as an undergraduate, that there wasn't something already built for me. We were really building it as we were sort of stepping down this path. There was a constant shift in change in priorities and funding based on who was in leadership at the time. This is still the case. But it made, at the time, building something really challenging if you weren't quite sure who was going to be in support of it from day to day, from year to year. There weren't a ton of support services. I had many friends who participated and graduated, but also many more who, after a year or two, left and didn't return to the university, some of which are returning now, others of which had really negative experiences and were just done. And a lot of the resources still needed to be developed. So we did have the beginning Tlingit textbook by the Dauenhauers, but we didn't have the workbook that we have now. A lot of the lesson plans that were created, the instructors that I had, it was like, again, sort of building those stepping stones as we were going, and it was a constant scramble. Sometimes it felt for Indigenous faculty to be creating all of the resources and teaching, and often having multiple positions, and juggling all of those responsibilities. There was a certain amount of stress and tension that even as an undergraduate you could feel when your instructors were scrambling to develop, the next day's work. As a graduate student, some positives. Being a graduate student at the University of British Columbia, funding. So there's funding available for Indigenous students to attend university there in a way that wasn't necessarily available here at UAS. Like, I wasn't funded. In a graduate school I am, which is, well, it's ran out, but I was at one point fully funded, which was great. The university recognized the need for change. So the University of British Columbia is quite large. And they recognize that some of these negatives that I'll talk about here in a second are things that need to be addressed. There's a freedom to do the work and how I felt best. So many, if not all of my committee members, supervisors, faculty members recognize that, having come from Juneau, having worked and built connections in the community, what the community thought I needed to focus on was important. They gave me the freedom to be able to do that, which is wonderful. And there's a desire to support the work. So many faculty members, my supervisors, are very keen on supporting language revitalization, which I understand from from talking with other individuals at other university settings is not always the case. Some challenges, though, are I don't think in all of my years at UBC I had a single Indigenous faculty member, and this is a huge institution. Either in linguistics or anthropology. Most support services for Indigenous students are aimed at undergraduates, which is understandable, but it also made sometimes being far away from home, being in Vancouver, really challenging when most of the support services weren't tailored to a graduate student experience. Huge bureaucracy. I know across our university systems, bureaucracy can become a huge issue, and particularly at UBC, it's a huge organization. I think the university itself, just in-person campus, is as big as Juneau's. There's 32,000 people just in that section of Vancouver, so it's huge. And navigating some of those things was a huge culture shock coming from UAS, where you go and talk to the registrar. It's 3 people, you know them by first name. That transition to a larger bureaucratic system was quite challenging. And there seemed to be an unfamiliarity with how best to train students to do this specific work. So there was the support, the desire, the freedom to do the work in a way that was collaborative and community focused, but there wasn't a lot of people who were familiar with how to do that. So it was kind of making up the process and building it with the community, and then telling my supervisors this is what I was going to do, and not as much training and support in actually how to do that. As a researcher, I get to do some pretty cool stuff. Think, read, talk with people, experience language work, and then reflect on that process. I get to think about things, and there are a number of Indigenous scholars within the university setting that I'm citing here: Leonard, Barrows, Smith, Wilson, Tuck, and Yang that reflected on being Indigenous scholars and their experience doing Indigenous-focused research. These are just a handful of some really good examples on different thoughts on this from Indigenous scholars, so not all of them agree, even within these sources, on how best to do this work, what role the university plays in the work. Some are more burn the system down, it's not built for us. Others are let's bend the system to our needs, in various positions in between. So I'll have links to those sources if you're interested at the end of the presentation. But really thinking about what does it mean to do research, what is research, what can research be, if research is thinking and reflecting and talking with people, experiencing the work, leading, getting advice from elders and having the elders lead that process. How is that in line with a more Western academic understanding of research? How is that different? And how can we have a conversation about the needs for research, which is sometimes, I'm trying to remember who said this, research as a dirty word, because of that historical trauma of, again, researchers coming in and taking information. How can we have a conversation about research, indigenized research, in a way that is useful? But it's not just research around language, so I do language research. There's a lot of things about Tlingit that we know, there's a lot of things about Tlingit that we don't know, and being able to teach the language effectively, we kind of need to be able to ask these questions about how sentences are put together, what dialects are, how do we make sure that we're supporting students when they get to these advanced levels of learning, sort of guiding them through some language concepts that as a first-generation Tlingit speaker, seem very obvious, but as a learner, we have to kind of teach these patterns to ourselves. So not just doing research around language in that capacity, but also researching the research process itself. So what works, what doesn't, what can research be, what should it be, all of these big questions. And it's not just turning the gaze back. So there's this idea of talking back to the university, turning the gaze back, critiquing a system which very rightfully so has been a colonial force within the communities, but recognizing that at least in my perspective, especially going to UAS where many of my faculty were Indigenous, that mythos of the university being this purely white, heteronormative ivory tower institution doesn't exist in reality, that the fundamental structure certainly is built to maintain that ideology, but the reality, there are faculty, Indigenous faculty in university systems, there are Indigenous students in the university systems, there are Indigenous staff in the university systems, and we have to recognize that Indigenous people exist in those spaces. Much like the mythology that the US is a monolingual English-speaking country, that wasn't true prior to colonization, wasn't true during colonization. Many people came speaking many different languages, but this idea that the US is monolingual speaking continues to persist, and that push of reality and myth continues to be tugged and pulled within policy. An important critique of the academy has been that it only talks to academics, with academics sort of being shorthand for this very narrow vision of what it means to be an academic. That is certainly still an issue, but hopefully is becoming less the default as we grow students, faculty, staff with Indigenous perspectives. As a professor, some things that have been quite positive is the inclusion, however late, of Indigenous perspectives, the ability to connect with and support Indigenous students, the opportunity to engage with and evaluate societal values, so being able to connect with people who are at the very beginning stages of their career, being able to talk about what sort of society we want to see, what do we see currently, what do we want to build together, being able to engage with students in that way has been a hugely positive experience, and the chance to connect with non-Indigenous allies. So you're also connecting not just with students, Indigenous students who are coming and are interested in language work, language revitalization, cultural revitalization, but you're able to connect with non-Indigenous allies who are also interested in doing that but maybe don't know where to start. So being able to have those conversations with people regardless of heritage has also been a really big positive influence in the movement, I think. Some challenges, of course, are the continued devaluation and undervaluation of Indigenous experiences and practices outside of the established norms. So one example is the tenure process. So tenure, how do you get a permanent position at the university? Often this privileges publishing, which means reading, writing, often in isolation, spending a lot of hours, days, years, thinking about things, often by yourself, putting it all to paper, sending it to a publication, getting that little line on your CV, and the undervaluation of experiences like sitting with elders in community, going out hunting, building connections with community in a way that non-Indigenous people perhaps don't understand the importance of, but constantly having to have the conversation about being in community for Ku'ik is just as important as sitting down and writing a paper. Continues to be an issue and a conversation that needs to be had. Knowledge behind a paywall. University is expensive, and while we have been really good at building scholarships, connecting with community partners, Alaska corporations and their nonprofit arms, tribal corporations, classes still, the price of classes continues to be a barrier. There's always this ethical conversation around why should Indigenous students have to pay to learn a language that the educational system is taken from them. At least at UAS, we're now able to offer classes, language classes for free, but then we have this huge demand, which is wonderful. And so how do we make sure that we're able to offer these classes in a way that's attainable and also able to pay the instructors for the knowledge, the time, the grading, all of that stuff. Hierarchy, so university systems are kind of by nature hierarchical. There are people at the top, there are people at the bottom, and having to navigate some of those things, whether that be older faculty that have had positions for a really long time and perhaps have not had to think reflexively about how that position came to be, can inspire some hard conversations, I think, as we're hoping to change some of these systems. And then overworked. Everybody's overworked and underpaid, and that is no different in university settings than it is anywhere else. So another challenge. Successes and challenges, though, within these systems. So this is pretty Juneau-focused because that's what I'm most familiar with at the moment, but this can certainly be applicable to other language communities, that there are programs within our educational systems. So we have Hayuk Tangi Kuri, we have an immersion, preschool immersion language nest that teaches all in Tlingit, which is run, I believe, under the tribe. We have Tlingit culture and language, Tlingit Culture, Common Language and Literacy, the TCLL program, which is an elementary school program, I think in one or two of our elementary schools in Juneau, that focuses on language but also culture and literacy. And sometimes that big mission can make language teaching in particular challenging, but that is available and has been available for some time within the Tlingit language communities. Tlingit language classes in middle and high school, including dual enrollment. So these are subject classes. You can take Tlingit language class in middle school and in high school and get dual enrollment. So college credit, oftentimes, at least at the high school level. So those are available, but those are often very hard fought to be paid equitably, to encourage the high school and middle schools to actually offer those classes. So far, I think for a number of years now, they have been available, but there seems to always be this conversation about whether that's going to continue. And then the University of Alaska Southeast, there's Tlingit language classes you can take, Haida and Tsimshian classes as well for credit or not for credit. There is a number of certificates. So there's an Indigenous language teaching certificate that launched a year ago, along with a speaking certificate. There's soon to be a Bachelor of Arts in Alaska Native languages. Well, there's like a 3-tier track and hopefully a master's degree sometime next year. So we're building these programs up from what it seems like 10 years ago, a fight just to get a BLA distinction. I think when I was an undergrad, there wasn't even a Tlingit minor, or maybe it had been discontinued and they had to reinsert it into the catalog. So there are things that are built, things that are available. But these programs are all nested in established systems. They're nested in university systems that operate or have operated in a certain way. They're nested in school districts that have operated in a certain way, and having conversations about how some of those systems need to change to better support the work in a way that's not tokenizing, that's not, okay, we're offering you class, what more do you want from us? But it's actually effective and is valued by not just the community, but by the larger system itself. I do think that we're making big changes in that direction. I do think more and more people seems to be quite supportive, but if anybody's read the Juno Empire comments about any program that's launched, there's always people that exist in our communities that are hurt individuals that have a lot of negative things to say. Working in established systems comes with that historical baggage. I know many speakers over this conference have talked about the legacy of boarding schools, the legacy of negative experiences in our educational systems today, racism that's perpetuated in our systems today, and so having to have not just encourage people and give people the tools to learn language, but make sure that those spaces are safe for them to do so, make sure it's an environment that people want to be in, that we're not traumatizing or re-traumatizing students, faculty, staff, by encouraging them to be part of these systems when we know the systems themselves aren't healthy. So some challenges there. So some things I think, some needed changes I think sort of in relationship to that, looking at how the systems are built so far. Looking at the processes we have and suggesting processes that value the importance of relationship building, community building, health, rest, and well-being as integral to the position. So not something that we just say, oh, sure, you can go off and do that as a sort of extra, I suppose I'll allow it, but have it be a core part of the position itself. One particular scholar that I feel like is having, particularly around rest, that's having really pushing this reflection on the importance of rest is Tricia Hersey. Rest is Resistance. Her book is coming out in a couple of weeks, but talking about the importance of being able to rest as people in response to colonization, where in this idea of grind culture that's just not good for human beings, particularly not good for Black, Indigenous people of color who've experienced this constant push within systems to be productive, to be active members of society, to be constantly producing work, to not be leisurely or lazy, like these often, I guess, protests to, oh, why do you need to go hunting for certain periods of the year? Why do you need to participate in ku'ik? Like this misunderstanding, sometimes intentional misunderstanding of the importance of these practices and the need to rest and be healthy human beings. Some other needed changes, not just supplementary, but fundamental inclusion of Indigenous sources across disciplines. So there was a presentation at the Linguistic Society of America a couple of years ago where the Cite Black Women gave a presentation. The Cite Black Women movement gave a presentation around radical praxis of citation. What does that mean? The inclusion, and not just the inclusion, but like the core fundamental practice of citing Black scholars, Black women scholars, kind of in line with Audre Lorde, who's a Black female scholar, philosopher, poet, making sure that when we're having conversations around Indigenous language, Indigenous work, that Indigenous people are in those conversations, even in that citation, even in the readings that you're doing. And I was speaking with René for his podcast, if you guys know, he's got a pod. Anyways, talking about this very thing, talking about the importance of citing Indigenous scholars when we're doing Indigenous work, and he sort of reminded me it's not just for Indigenous classes, right? It's not just for Indigenous studies classes, it's not just in language work, but all the disciplines across our academic systems need to be including as fundamental sources Indigenous knowledge, because so many of those disciplines, whether it's law, science, marine biology, have taken or distilled or extracted information about processes and presented it as a largely Western concept. That's simply not the case. So many Indigenous scholars, historically and contemporarily, have built foundations for these disciplines. They need to be cited and acknowledged accordingly, just like we do when we tell traditional stories. We tell who we heard it from, who talked to us. We cite, even in our oral traditions, where we're getting this knowledge, we need to hold our university systems accountable and make sure that they're doing the same. And collaborative and meaningful partnerships outside of traditional academic institutions. I do think that this is changing, but it needs to be less about, okay, the university, this top-down approach, we have a research agenda, we're going to go talk to a community, we're going to make sure that the community says, yeah, that's fine, and more of we're going to actually build something together in a peer-to-peer relationship. And if it's something around Indigenous language or Indigenous knowledge, that Indigenous community should be taking the lead on those conversations, because it is ideally for the benefit first of that community and for the benefit of academic thought second, I think. So some takeaway thoughts around all that there. The work should be, at least in my experience, intersectional. Everybody comes with multiple identities, multiple experiences, and we should be able to honor those different experiences in a way that makes sense for those individuals. Universities are Indigenous spaces. We need to have this shift in paradigm around the fundamental assumption that Indigenous people aren't in the room. I think we're getting better at this, but there are still classes, talks, conferences, not shade to this conference, this one I think has done quite a good job, but other conferences that still seem to operate under this fundamental belief. Even if you ask somebody directly, do you know that there's an Indigenous person here? They might say yes, but the way we talk about things sometimes makes it very much seem like there's still this mythos around Indigenous people not existing anymore. And I think we need to reflect on the way we talk about things in order to make sure that that's not the case. We have Indigenous students, we have Indigenous faculty, we have Indigenous academics, Indigenous scholars, both trained in the university system and trained in community systems that need to be honored and represented, included in these conversations in a meaningful and fundamental way. Not just students, but faculty and staff as well. So we're not just talking directly to students, Indigenous students, as if we're passing off this knowledge in this sort of sage pedestal way, but having meaningful conversations around life experiences, recognizing that just because I'm standing here in front of the room, that there are so many things that you all could share with me, and that this is reciprocal exchange of knowledge and information, thoughts, conversations around this work. Indigenous people aren't just part of the conversation. When it comes to Indigenous languages, Indigenous people are the conversation. They should be leading the conversation, shaping it, researching it. This doesn't mean non-Indigenous people can't be involved, they can't be included, that they don't have an important role to play, but this idea that we're constantly being invited to the table, I'm sure I'm not the first person to talk about this. The table needs to be an Indigenous one at this point. We're at a point where we have enough faculty, we have enough people who've been doing this work for a number of years, we have enough elders who have been working with academics for a number of years, that the table, the land that the table is under is Indigenous, the table needs to be an Indigenous-led table as well. It was Indigenous knowledge that built many of our current disciplines now taught, however warped they might be. So this reclaiming of knowledge, this reclaiming of ways of knowing that elders gave to these disciplines, gave to academics, were always intended, I believe, for the descendants, for their community, for the benefit of their people. And so this is not we're pushing to make space. The space was already made by the people who'd done this work in the past. We're reclaiming that knowledge and ensuring that it's useful and brought into the community in a meaningful way. So I always think about for what, for why. So .yisaway, .qasaway. In Lingít, there's two different ways of asking for what. One is for what benefit, and one is for what purpose. I think one of the guiding principles is we do this work, whatever the work might be, whether you're an artist, whether you're a cultural knowledge holder, whether you're learning language, teaching language, to strengthen ourselves, to make ourselves better people, and to strengthen our communities, to make our communities stronger, to reclaim, revitalize what hasn't been lost, but what has perhaps been sleeping. So some final thoughts, going back to that very first question, what role can or should academia play in Indigenous language revitalization? I think whatever role the community finds appropriate, including whatever role Indigenous scholars steer academia in. I think at this point we have a strong core of people who have been thinking about this for a long time, and I'm very hopeful for the future that we'll see a more indigenized, more equitable, more welcoming space within our university systems here in Alaska, in the Yukon, and across Turtle Island. Thank you so much for listening to me. Appreciate your time. Yeah, Chief. I think we have time for questions if folks have them. Thoughts, reflections. Yeah.
It's a wonderful presentation, and I feel like also just like this is the beating heart of sharing our knowledge, which you presented here, which is how do Indigenous communities and scholarly communities meet each other on a plane of real respect and dialogue. So to have sort of named it and put it out there like that is beautiful.
Jeez.
And you know, as a non-Lingít person who's working on Lingít, you know, it's just hugely important to hear these things. So playing with Chief, and I wanted to ask you one sort of tiny little, almost like insider baseball question, which is
Sure.
the thing about the paywalls. You know, because I just encountered that myself in a piece of writing about, you know, about my work on Lingít, where, you know, the publisher had just such ridiculous rules about where you could post these things online, and it made me so mad, you know, that, like, you know, only people with a university library card can access this stuff.
Right.
And I just, I wonder, and you know, I almost am embarrassed to bring it up because like yesterday at the Clan House, like the conversation was about saving the world, and like I know the paywall thing is like way smaller, but still it's important anyway. And I just wondered if you have any thoughts about like, you know, what do we do with that stupid system where, you know, all this scholarly knowledge that people are producing, you know, for the sake of knowledge, no one's getting paid off of it except for these giant databases. You know, it's not about money, it's not about copyright, it's just about restricting access, you know, for these huge organizations. And like, what do we do to resist that, or what's the best strategy there?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and I feel like it's something that both in Indigenous academic spheres, in non-Indigenous academic, the idea that your work is behind some sort of database paywall. There seems to be a really big push for open source, open access publications and journalism, and making sure, again, that this work is open to anybody who needs it. I know with Indigenous work, there are, you know, certain clan restrictions, certain access to traditional knowledge that needs to be restricted based on cultural protocol, but for things like academic work, where the community has said make it available to learners however you can, this push to normalize open access journals, open access sources, making things free and available. I mean, I know René posts PDFs of everything on lingitlanguage.com, but that hasn't been without controversy. Like, there are publishers that try and sue him for that. And so I think it's, again, going back to that valuation, devaluation, a system that's built to create a certain elite, the academic elite that have access to this, that have money to this, is something that our larger university systems really need to contend with, and something that I'm cautiously optimistic is a conversation that's continuing to build. Because, yeah, like you said, it's not the researcher, it's not the professor getting paid for anything, it's these big journals, these big databases. And so when we're talking about the tenure process, talking about what's valued and not, I'm hopeful that in that conversation, publication, open access publication, if that's a route somebody wants to go, Indigenous scholar wants to go, that it is as valued as, publishing in these very restricted paywall kind of spheres. It's certainly a slow conversation, but it is one that's happening. I don't have a solution, but that was some thoughts. Yeah.
In the context of being Indigenous and in the, in academia at the higher levels, I've heard over the years a lot of talk about like being in two worlds or being in two cultures, but it always struck me as weird, like a strange idea, and I've never been comfortable with it, and I'm not entirely sure why. So I wondered if you'd thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways like that metaphor is often like used as a shorthand for like these competing, feeling like these competing ways of being. And I think it goes back to this sort of fractured identity that we see having been superimposed by colonization, this idea that you're a certain percentage of Indigenous, you're a certain percentage of non-Indigenous, you're an enrolled member or not, this idea of hierarchies. I understand why people use that metaphor, like I'm working in two different worlds. Being in community is so much different than being in a university setting, but I want to be comfortable being who I am regardless of where I am. I want to be able to express, I mean, the way I talk with my friends might be a little bit different than the way I talk in front of a group like this, but I think as we push to indigenize spaces, the goal would be to sort of blur some of these, oh, you have to be Native over here and only in these contexts, and you have to act non-Native in these other contexts. And I think that's perhaps part of the reason why going through university systems as an Indigenous student can be so challenging is because you're asked to sort of shove certain parts of your identity into these little boxes and be somebody different in these spaces. And so I think the goal would be that that's unnecessary, that you're able to be your full self regardless of where you're at. But I understand why the metaphor is there as well, because of that push that society has structured us to be certain ways, and in order to be successful, to be considered successful, you have to behave in one way or the other. So I'm hopeful by indigenizing, by including more Indigenous faculty, scholars, staff, Indigenous students in the process, that some of this two-world, feeling like you're constantly pulled in two different directions, will be less mentally challenging, will be less spiritually challenging to have to do that, because it can be uncomfortable not to be able to be who you are, wherever you are. I think that's probably part of the dissonance. Sheesh.
Do you have time to talk after? I'd love to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good cheese.
Aww.